The morning sun cast long shadows across the red earth of Ouagadougou, capital of Burkina Faso. The presidential palace stood like a fortress against the azure sky, its white walls gleaming in the early light. At the main gate, two soldiers sat, under a makeshift canopy, sipping sweet tea from small glasses. The city was awakening slowly, vendors setting up their stalls, children in crisp uniforms walking to school, the familiar sounds of mopeds puttering through dusty streets. Captain. Yakuba adjusted his beret and glanced at his watch. Another quiet morning in what had become an increasingly turbulent presidency. President Ibrahim Traoré had been making waves across West Africa with his defiant stance against foreign interference. The young leader, barely 35, had already expelled French diplomats, rejected IMF loan conditions, and formed new alliances with Russia and China. Some called him brave, others whispered he was reckless. The tranquility shattered when a figure appeared on the horizon, walking with purposeful strides toward the palace. At first, the guards paid little attention. Visitors, protesters, and curious tourists were common enough. But as the figure drew closer, they straightened in their chairs. It was a woman, tall and graceful, her dark skin glistening with a light sheen of perspiration from the morning heat. She wore a vibrant yellow bubu that flowed like liquid gold around her figure, and her head was wrapped in matching fabric that framed her face like a crown. Her beauty was undeniable, but there was something else. An intensity in her gaze that made the guards uncomfortable. She walked directly to the gate without hesitation, her bare feet making no sound on the hot pavement. The guards exchanged glances. Protocol was clear. No unauthorized personnel could approach the presidential residence. "Madame, you cannot be here," Captain Yakuba called out in French, standing from his chair. "This is a restricted area." The woman stopped just 3 meters from the gate and looked directly into his eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and confident, carrying a slight Nigerian accent that marked her as foreign. "I wish to see President Traoré," she said simply. "Do you have an appointment?" The second guard, Sergeant Ouedraogo, asked, already, knowing the answer. The woman smiled. Not the nervous smile of someone caught trespassing, but something serene and almost amused. "I do not need an appointment. I have come from Lagos to marry him." The two guards stared at her in stunned silence for a moment before Yakuba burst into laughter. Even the usually stoic Ouedraogo cracked a smile. "Madame, you cannot be serious," Yakuba said, wiping tears from his eyes. "You think you can just walk up to the presidential palace and propose marriage to our president?" But the woman's expression hadn't changed. She wasn't laughing, she wasn't smiling. She stood there with the gravity of someone making a formal declaration of war. "I am completely serious," she said. "My name is Amara Okoro. I have traveled over 1,000 kilometers to be here. I will not leave until I speak with President Traoré, and when I do, he will understand why I have come." The guards' amusement quickly faded as they realized this was no joke. Yakuba reached for his radio, but before he could call for backup, the woman did something unexpected. She sat down on the dusty ground right in front of the gate and folded her hands in her lap. "I will wait here," she announced. Word traveled fast through the palace corridors. By noon, everyone from kitchen staff to senior advisors had heard about the mysterious Nigerian woman sitting at the gate. Some found it amusing, others concerning. President Traoré himself was in a cabinet meeting when his chief of staff, a nervous man named Caboret, whispered the news in his ear. Traoré paused mid-sentence during his discussion of agricultural reforms and raised an eyebrow. "A woman wants to marry me?" "Yes, Mr. President. She's been sitting at the gate for hours. The press has started to gather." Traoré resumed his meeting without another word, but those who knew him well noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. The last thing he needed was a media circus during such delicate political times. Outside, Amara remained motionless under the blazing sun. The guards had offered her water, which she politely declined. They had offered shade, which she refused. Local journalists had arrived and were taking photos, shouting questions she ignored completely. "Who are you working for?" called out Aminata Sawadogo from Radio Omega. "Are you mentally ill?" shouted another reporter, less tactfully. "What message do you have for the president?" Amara answered none of them. She simply sat, occasionally shifting position to relieve the pressure on her legs, her eyes fixed on the palace gates as if she could will them to open through sheer determination. As the day wore on, a small crowd gathered. Some locals found the spectacle entertaining. A foreign woman staging what appeared to be a romantic protest. Street vendors saw opportunity, setting up nearby to sell water and snacks to the gathering crowd. Children pressed their faces against the fence, staring at the strange lady in yellow. But there were others watching too. Men in unmarked cars parked at strategic distances, agents from various intelligence services trying to determine if this was an elaborate publicity stunt, a psychological operation, or something more dangerous. By evening, Amara had been sitting for 8 hours without food or water. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, some in the crowd began to murmur with concern. The temperature would drop soon, and the woman showed no signs of leaving. Captain Yakuba approached her one more time. "Madame, it will be cold tonight. Perhaps you should return to your hotel and come back tomorrow." Amara looked up at him, and he was struck by the clarity in her eyes. No madness, no desperation, just unwavering resolve. "Captain," she said softly, "I have waited my whole life for a leader like Ibrahim Traoré. I can wait one more night." The second day brought more attention. International news outlets had picked up the story. Mysterious woman stages romantic siege at Burkina Faso presidential palace ran as a headline on BBC Africa. Social media buzzed with theories and memes. Some praised her dedication, others mocked her delusion. Inside the palace, the situation was becoming a problem. Minister Dwamba, a tall, elegant man in his 50s who had been one of Traoré's earliest supporters, paced anxiously in the president's office. "This is becoming a distraction, Ibrahim," he said, using the informal tone of old friendship. "The French consul called this morning. They're asking questions about security protocols. This woman could be anyone, a journalist, a spy, an assassin." President Traoré stood at his window, looking down at the small figure still sitting by the gate. She had not moved except to occasionally adjust her position. "What do you think, Minister? Does she look dangerous to you?" Dwamba moved to stand beside his president. "The most dangerous people rarely look the part," he said. "I recommend we have her arrested for disturbing the peace." But Traoré was quiet, studying the woman below. There was something about her stillness, her patience, that intrigued him. In his short but eventful political career, he had encountered many people who wanted something from him: money, position, access, favor. But this woman wanted nothing except his attention, and paradoxically, that made her the most interesting person who had approached him in months. "Let her stay," he said finally, "but increase security. If she's here for malicious purposes, she'll reveal herself eventually." On the ground, Amara was beginning to show signs of physical strain. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, her yellow dress was dusty and wrinkled, and when she stood to relieve herself in the small bathroom the guards had finally agreed to escort her to, she moved slowly. The crowd had grown larger. People brought their children to see the crazy woman who thinks she can marry the president. Others brought her small gifts: a banana, a bottle of water, a prayer bead, which she accepted gracefully but did not consume. It was on the third day that everything changed. The sun was particularly brutal, reaching nearly 40 degrees Celsius by noon. Amara had begun swaying slightly, though she continued to maintain her sitting position. The guards watched with growing concern. At 2:17 p.m., she collapsed. Captain Yakuba was the first to reach her, followed quickly by his men. Her breathing was shallow, her skin burning hot to the touch. The crowd pressed forward, some shouting for doctors, others demanding she be taken to hospital. "Open the gates!" Yakuba commanded. "Get her inside now!" As they carried her unconscious form through the presidential palace gates, nobody noticed the small smile that flickered across her lips. So brief, it might have been imagined. Amara, awakened in a room unlike any she had ever seen. High ceilings painted with traditional Burkina Faso motifs, expensive furniture that managed to blend African craftsmanship with modern elegance, and large windows that looked out over manicured gardens. She was lying on a four-poster bed, still, wearing her yellow dress, but now clean and pressed. A young woman in a nurse's uniform was checking her vital signs. "You're awake," she said in accented French. "How do you feel?" "Where am I?" Amara asked, though she suspected she knew. "In the presidential palace. You collapsed from dehydration and heat exhaustion. The president ordered that you be brought inside and cared for." Amara sat up slowly, testing her strength. Her strategy had worked, but she felt a pang of guilt at the deception. The collapse had been real enough. She had pushed herself to the brink, but she had timed it carefully. 3 days was long enough to create a story, to build sympathy, but not so long as to risk permanent damage. "I would like to thank the president," she said. "He will see you this evening," the nurse replied. "But first, you must eat and rest." As the day progressed, Amara was treated like an honored guest, rather than a security threat. She was brought traditional Burkina Faso cuisine, rice with peanut sauce, grilled fish, and sweet hibiscus tea. Palace staff who passed her room were curious but respectful. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but also something else, a cautious warmth. As the sun set, painting her room in golden light, there was a soft knock at her door. When she called, "Enter," the door opened to reveal a young man in simple military fatigues. No medals, no ceremonial dress, just clean olive green clothing and worn boots. If she hadn't recognized his face from photographs, she might have mistaken him for a mid-level officer. But there was no mistaking the presence that filled the room. Ibrahim Traoré moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to command, his eyes sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. He was younger than she had expected. The photographs didn't capture the boyishness that lingered around his eyes, or the premature lines that spoke of heavy responsibilities shouldered early. "You asked to see me," he said, closing the door. Behind him. "I am here." Amara stood and inclined her head respectfully. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. President. I know this is highly irregular." "Irregular is one word for it," Traoré replied, but his tone was more amused than annoyed. "Please, sit. I have questions." They sat across from each other in 2 chairs positioned by the window. The palace gardens spread below them, and in the distance, the lights of Ouagadougou twinkled like earthbound stars. "What is your name?" he asked. "Amara Okoro." "You are Nigerian?" "Yes, from Lagos." "And you came here to marry me?" Amara met his gaze steadily. "Yes." "Why?" It was the question she had been preparing for, but now, sitting across from him in the intimate setting, surrounded by the quiet grandeur of the palace, she found herself abandoning her rehearsed speeches. "Because Africa is bleeding," she said simply. "Because our leaders have become puppets dancing to foreign music. Because in Nigeria, I watched my father die for asking questions about oil money that never reached the people. Because I have seen too many presidents bow their heads and sell their people's future for a handful of silver." She leaned forward, her voice gaining intensity. "And because when I saw you on television, rejecting French demands, standing up, to the World Bank, choosing Russia over colonial masters, I saw something I had never seen before, a young African leader who was not afraid. Traoré was quiet for a long moment. "And you think marrying me will accomplish what, exactly?" "I think," Amara said carefully, "that you are in more danger than you realize. I think the people you trust most are the ones you should fear. And I think that when your enemies come for you, and they will come, you will need someone beside you who has nothing to gain and everything to lose." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Traoré's relaxed posture stiffened, and his eyes sharpened to laser focus. "What do you know about my enemies?" Amara took a deep breath. This was the moment everything would change, for both of them. "I know that Minister Douamba has been meeting with French intelligence operatives. I know that your gold mining contracts are being secretly renegotiated. I know that there is a plan to destabilize your government, and it will come from within, your own circle." The silence that followed was deafening. President Traoré did not sleep that night. He walked the corridors of the presidential palace, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. Could this mysterious Nigerian woman be telling the truth? Or was she the most sophisticated plant he had ever encountered? Minister Douamba had been his friend since university. They had planned revolution together in late-night sessions over warm beer and cheap cigarettes. When Traoré had come to power, through the military coup that ousted President Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, Douamba had been his first and most crucial appointment. The idea that his oldest ally could be betraying him felt like a physical blow. But certain things began to make sense in this new light. The mining contracts that had been delayed for technical reviews, the security briefings that sometimes felt incomplete, the subtle pressure to moderate his stance against French interests. At dawn, Traoré called his most trusted intelligence officer, Captain Fatimata Nakanabo, known simply as Na, to her colleagues. A woman in her early 30s, with the build of a marathon runner and eyes like steel traps, she had been trained by the best intelligence services in Africa and had never failed to ferret out a secret. "I have a delicate assignment," Traoré told her as they walked through the palace gardens away from potential listening devices. "The Nigerian woman? You think she's a threat?" Na was quiet for a moment, her analytical mind working through the possibilities. "Any unknown variable is a potential threat. But, Mr. President, if I may speak freely, always. She spent 3 days in blazing sun without food or water. That level of commitment suggests either fanatical devotion or professional training. Both are dangerous, but in different ways." Traoré nodded. "I want you to watch her. But more importantly, I want you to verify what she told me last night." He repeated Amara's accusations about Minister Douamba. Na's expression didn't change, but Traoré noticed her hands clench slightly, a tell he had learned to recognize. "How long do you need?" he asked. "Give me 48 hours, Na replied. "If there's something to find, I'll find it." Meanwhile, Amara was settling into a strange routine as an unofficial palace resident. She was given considerable freedom to move around the public areas, always under discreet surveillance. The staff had begun to warm to her. She was unfailingly polite, helped with small tasks without being asked, and seemed genuinely interested in learning about Burkina Faso culture. But she was also conducting her own subtle intelligence gathering. In conversations with gardeners, cooks, and cleaning staff, she picked up fragments of information about palace routines, security protocols, and the personalities of key officials. She was particularly interested in Minister Douamba. "He is a good man," said Mariam, an elderly woman who managed the palace laundry. "Very educated, very proper, but what?" Mariam looked around nervously before leaning closer. "He has expensive tastes for someone on a government salary. New car every year, designer clothes. His children attend private school in France. We noticed these things. It wasn't proof, but it was confirmation of Amara's suspicions." That evening she was summoned to dinner with the president. Not a private meal this time, but a formal state dinner with several cabinet ministers and their wives. She was given an elegant dress to wear, deep blue silk with silver embroidery, and found herself seated at Traoré's right hand. Minister Dwamba sat directly across from her. He was an imposing man with graying temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to respect. Throughout the meal, he engaged her in polite conversation, his English impeccable, his manner charming. He asked about her family, her education, her impressions of Burkina Faso. He seemed genuinely interested in her answers. And that, Amara realized, was what made him so dangerous. If he was indeed a traitor, he was a masterful one. "Miss Okoro," he said as dessert was being served, "may I ask what your profession is in Nigeria?" "I work in agricultural development," she replied, a carefully constructed half-truth. She had indeed worked with farming cooperatives, though not in the capacity she was implying. "How interesting. And what brought you to our country? Besides your romantic designs on our president, of course." His smile was warm, but his eyes were calculating. "I believe in African self-determination," Amara said carefully. "President Traoré represents something new, leadership that puts African interests first." "A noble sentiment," Dwamba agreed, "though I sometimes wonder if idealism is enough in the complex world of international relations." It was a subtle probe, and Amara recognized it as such. "Compromise has its place," she said, "but some principles are not negotiable." Across the table, she caught Traoré watching their exchange with intense focus. The evening continued with cultural performances and traditional music, but Amara felt the undercurrent of tension throughout. As guests were leaving, Minister Dwamba approached her one final time. "I hope you will be very happy here, Miss Okoro," he said, taking her hand in both of his. "Burkina Faso can be challenging for outsiders who don't understand our complexities. It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't a welcome either." "Captain, Na worked with the efficiency of a surgeon and the patience of a hunter." Within 24 hours, she had confirmed what many in the intelligence community had suspected but could never prove. Minister Dwamba was living well beyond his official means. Bank. Records showed regular deposits from shell companies traced to French corporate interests. Phone records revealed encrypted communications with known DGSE, French Foreign Intelligence operatives. Most damaging of all, surveillance footage from 3 months prior showed Dwamba meeting with Jean-Claude Martineau, a French consul officially. Responsible for cultural affairs, but known to intelligence services as a coordination point for economic espionage. But Na was thorough. Before presenting her findings, she wanted to create a controlled situation that would force Dwamba to reveal himself definitively. She designed what intelligence officers call a canary trap, false information given to suspected sources to see if it surfaces elsewhere. She approached Dwamba with a fabricated intelligence report suggesting that President Traoré was planning to nationalize all foreign-owned mining operations within 30 days. The report was plausible enough to seem real, urgent enough to demand action, and specific enough that if it leaked, Ney would know exactly where it came from. The trap was set on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday evening, French embassy communications were buzzing with urgent messages about protecting mining assets. The leak was confirmed, but Dwamba had been equally busy setting a trap of his own. He had become increasingly concerned about Amara's influence over the president. Her presence was disrupting carefully laid plans that had been months in the making. The French weren't paying him for complications. He arranged for a coded message to be delivered to Amara's room. "The lion is bleeding." It was a phrase that would mean nothing to palace security, but everything to someone with connections to Pan-African resistance networks. Na's surveillance team captured Amara receiving the message, reading it, and immediately burning it. To Na, this looked like espionage. To Dwamba, it was confirmation of his own suspicions about Amara's true identity. Both were partially right and completely wrong. The message was indeed a code, but not from foreign intelligence. It came from a network of African activists who had been tracking political developments across the continent. They had identified Amara and were warning her that Traoré's position was becoming untenable, that the Lion, African leadership, was bleeding under attack. But the damage was done. Na reported to President Traoré that both Minister Dwamba and Amara appeared to be engaged in covert communications with outside parties. "Sir," Na said as she presented her findings in the president's private office, "I believe you may be facing a sophisticated intelligence operation involving multiple parties with conflicting interests." Traoré studied the evidence: financial records, communications intercepts, surveillance photos. The case against Dwamba was overwhelming. The case against Amara was circumstantial but troubling. "What do you recommend?" "Controlled confrontation. We forced them to show their hands simultaneously. It was a dangerous game, but Traoré had built his political career on calculated risks." "Set it up," he said. That night, Amara received an unexpected visitor. Two men dressed as palace guards entered her room after midnight, supposedly to escort her to a secure location for her protection. But something felt wrong. The guards were too tense, their weapons too prominent, their explanations too vague. They moved to restrain her. Amara made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. From beneath her pillow, she produced a 6-inch blade, a gift from her grandmother, carried for protection during her travels, and held it with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." The confrontation lasted only seconds. Na's surveillance team, alerted by the disturbance, burst into the room and arrested the two fake guards. Under interrogation, they revealed they had been hired by Minister Dwamba to relocate the Nigerian woman to a secure facility outside the capital. The trap had sprung, but not in the way anyone had expected. Dawn brought chaos to the presidential palace. Minister Dwamba, realizing his agents had failed and been captured, made the desperate decision to accelerate his timeline. He called an emergency cabinet meeting, ostensibly to address security concerns raised by the previous night's incident. But President Traoré was already 3 moves ahead. As ministers filed into the conference room, they found themselves facing not their usual agenda, but Captain Na and a team of presidential guards with arrest warrants. "Gentlemen," Traoré said as he entered the room, "we have a problem." He laid out the evidence methodically: the financial records, the French contacts, the attempted kidnapping of Amara, the leaked intelligence. Some ministers shifted uncomfortably. Others looked shocked. A few appeared relieved that suspicions were finally being addressed openly. Minister Dwamba sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. When Traoré finished speaking, the room was silent except for the hum of air conditioning. "Well?" Traoré asked, looking directly at his old friend. "Do you have anything to say?" Dwamba stood slowly, straightened his tie, and looked around the room at his colleagues. When he spoke, his voice was steady and dignified. "Ibrahim, you are making a mistake that will cost you everything. Explain. You think this is about money, about personal betrayal. You're wrong. This is about survival. Not just yours, but the survival of Burkina Faso as a viable state." Dwamba moved to the window, looking out over the capital city. "You cannot fight the entire Western world with rhetoric and good intentions. They have resources, connections, economic leverage that you cannot imagine. I was trying to find a middle path, a way for you to maintain power while accommodating the realities of international relations. By selling our sovereignty? By preserving what we could while we still had the chance to negotiate." Dwamba turned back to face the room. "Now you've chosen confrontation over compromise. Do you have any idea what that means?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Every person in the room understood the implications. Small African nations that defied major powers rarely prospered. The history was written in coup attempts, economic sanctions, and mysterious accidents befalling troublesome leaders. "It means," said a quiet voice from the doorway, "that you fight or you die on your knees." Everyone turned to see Amara standing at the entrance to the conference room. She was dressed simply in traditional Burkina cloth, her hair wrapped in a colorful head wrap, but she moved with the authority of someone who belonged in the room. "Miss Okoro," Minister Dwamba said with a slight smile, "how good of you to join us, though I'm not sure civilians are typically invited to cabinet meetings." "I'm not here as a civilian," Amara replied, walking slowly to the center of the room. "I'm here as a witness." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each minister in turn. "My name is Amara Okoro, and I am the daughter of Chinua Okoro, the Nigerian journalist who was killed in 2018 for investigating oil corruption. Before he died, he was working on a story about how Western intelligence services maintain control over African governments through a network of compromised officials. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. He discovered that the same patterns repeated across the continent. Promising young leaders would come to power with popular support and revolutionary ideals. Then, gradually, their closest advisors would be approached, recruited, turned. Financial, incentives, threats against family members, promises of protection, whatever worked. The leaders themselves were rarely directly corrupted. Instead, they were slowly isolated, fed false information, guided toward decisions that served foreign interests while believing they were acting independently. She turned to face Minister Dwamba directly. "My father identified you as a key node in this network 3 months before his death." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Several ministers looked shocked, others frightened. Minister Dwamba's composed facade finally cracked. "You have no proof of any of this," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Amara reached into her dress and pulled out a small digital recorder. "Actually, I do." She pressed play, and Minister Dwamba's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable, speaking in French with a pronounced accent that could only be his contact at the French embassy. "The president is becoming impossible to control. We need to consider more direct action." The recording continued for 3 minutes, detailing plans to undermine Traoré's government through economic sabotage, media manipulation, and, if necessary, supporting a military coup. As the recording ended, Minister Dwamba seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds. His shoulders sagged, and he sat down heavily in his chair. "When did you record this?" he asked quietly. "Last week. You met with Jean-Claude Martineau at the Grand Hotel. I was at the next table." President Traoré looked at Amara with a mixture of admiration and wariness. "You've been conducting your own intelligence operation." "I've been trying to keep you alive," she replied. "The question now is, what do we do next?" The arrest of Minister Dwamba sent shockwaves through Burkina Faso's political establishment and beyond. Within hours, diplomatic cables were flying between Ouagadougou and Paris, emergency meetings were being called at the French Foreign Ministry, and international news outlets were scrambling to understand the implications of what appeared to be a major espionage scandal. But President Traoré knew that removing a traitor was only the first step in a much larger battle. As he sat in his office that evening with Amara and Captain Na, reviewing intelligence reports and diplomatic communications, the full scope of the challenge became clear. "They're not going to let this stand," Na said, pointing to a summary of French media coverage. "Look at the narrative they're already constructing. Paranoid African dictator destroys relationship with longtime ally based on accusations from mysterious foreign woman. They're painting you as unstable and Amara as a manipulative influence." Traoré rubbed his temples. "What about regional support?" "Mixed. Ghana and Senegal are calling for calm and dialogue. Nigeria has been notably silent. Mali and Niger are supportive, but they have their own problems. The African Union is scheduling an emergency session but won't commit to a position yet. Amara had been quiet during this exchange, but now she leaned forward. Ibrahim, there's something else you need to know. Both Traoré and Na turned to look at her. Minister Dwamba wasn't working alone. The intelligence network my father discovered operates in at least 12 African countries. They've been planning a coordinated response to what they call the new wave of African nationalism. Leaders like you who are rejecting Western economic control. She pulled out a tablet and showed them a map with red dots marking capital cities across West and Central Africa. These are all countries where similar operations are underway. The goal isn't just to remove you from power, it's to send a message that no African leader can successfully challenge the existing order. Na studied the map. What kind of message? Total economic isolation followed by regime change, Amara replied. They're going to make Burkina Faso an example. Sanctions, frozen assets, media campaigns, support for opposition groups, and ultimately, either a coup or civil unrest that forces you out. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. President Traoré had known his policies would create international tensions, but the scope and coordination of the response was beyond what he had anticipated. Unless, Amara continued, we move first. Explain, Traoré said. Information warfare. We release everything. All the evidence about the intelligence network, the recorded conversations, the financial records, the assassination plans. We make it a continental scandal, not just a bilateral issue between Burkina Faso and France. Na was skeptical. That's extremely dangerous. If we miscalculate, we could end up completely isolated. We're going to be isolated anyway, Amara pointed out. The question is whether we control the narrative or they do. President Traoré was quiet for a long time, weighing options that all carried enormous risks. Finally, he made his decision. We go public, but we do it right. Full disclosure, complete transparency, and we invite international observers to verify everything. Over the next 48 hours, the presidential palace became a hub of frenetic activity. Press releases were drafted and translated into multiple languages. Documentary evidence was compiled and verified, and secure communications were established with journalists and activists across Africa. The story broke simultaneously on 3 continents. African media outlets published detailed exposés of the intelligence network. European newspapers received leaked diplomatic cables showing the coordination between government officials and corporate interests, and American social media platforms exploded with leaked recordings and financial documents. The reaction was immediate and explosive. French President Emmanuel Macron called an emergency meeting of European leaders to discuss what he termed a coordinated disinformation campaign. African civil society organizations demanded investigations in their own countries. The United Nations announced they were monitoring the situation with concern. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Other compromised officials began coming forward. Within a week, similar revelations emerged in Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Niger. Ministers and advisors who had been recruited by foreign intelligence services, fearing exposure, began cooperating with their own governments in exchange for reduced penalties. The scandal metastasized beyond what anyone had anticipated. However, Amara's predictions about retaliation proved accurate. Burkina Faso's foreign currency reserves were frozen in French banks. Trade agreements were suspended. International development aid was cut off. The economic pressure was immediate and severe. President Traoré addressed the nation on television, explaining the situation in clear, direct language. He acknowledged the economic hardships that would follow, but framed them as the price of independence. We have a choice, he said, looking directly into the camera. We can live as free people facing temporary hardships, or we can exist as comfortable slaves in permanent servitude. I know which choice our ancestors would make. Public reaction was divided but largely supportive. Protests in favor of the government filled the streets of Ouagadougou, while counter-protests organized by opposition groups demanded Traoré's resignation. The country teetered on the edge of crisis. 3 weeks after Minister Douamba's arrest, the first assassination attempt came at dawn. A car bomb exploded outside the presidential palace gates at exactly 6 a.m., during the changing of the guard when security protocols were briefly relaxed. The blast shattered windows throughout the complex and sent shockwaves through the city. Miraculously, no one was killed. The bomber had miscalculated the timing and detonated too early, but the message was unmistakable. President Traoré was in his office when the explosion rocked the building. Amara, who had been in the garden for her morning walk, was thrown to the ground by the force of the blast. As security teams rushed to lock down the palace, she found herself face to face with the reality that her presence had escalated the stakes beyond what she had anticipated. "This is because of me," she told Traoré as they huddled in the secure bunker beneath the presidential residence. "If I hadn't come here, if I hadn't pushed you to expose Douamba, none of this would be happening." Traoré looked at her in the dim emergency lighting, his face calm despite the chaos above. "Amara, they were always going to come for me. You didn't create this conflict. You revealed it. There's a difference." Captain Na's voice crackled through the communication system. "Mr. President, we've secured the perimeter. The attack appears to have been a lone operative, but we're treating this as the beginning of a coordinated campaign." Over the following days, the attacks escalated. Not direct military action, that would have been too obvious and provoked international condemnation, but a campaign of psychological warfare designed to create the impression that Traoré's government was losing control. Power grids failed mysteriously in key districts. Water treatment facilities experienced technical difficulties. Radio stations broadcasting pro-government content suffered equipment failures. Social media was flooded with rumors of military coups, economic collapse, and civil war. But something unexpected happened. Instead of panicking, the population began to organize. Neighborhood committees formed to provide security and essential services. University students created communication networks to counter disinformation. Religious leaders from different faiths united to call for national solidarity. Most surprisingly, support began arriving from unexpected international sources. Venezuela offered to provide fuel and technical assistance. Cuba sent doctors and teachers. Iran proposed favorable trade agreements. Even China, typically cautious about African political upheavals, quietly increased investment commitments. "It's working," Amara told Traoré one evening as they reviewed intelligence reports in his office. "The more pressure they apply, the more it validates everything we've been saying about foreign interference." But Traoré was studying a different set of reports, ones that concerned him more. "The economic pressure is starting to bite. Food prices are up 30%. Unemployment is rising, and we're running through our currency reserves faster than anticipated. How long can we hold out? 6 months, maybe less, before we face serious social unrest." It was then that Amara made a proposal that would change everything. "What if we don't have to hold out? What if we go on the offensive?" She spread out a map of West Africa on his desk, marking several countries with red pins. "Look at the pattern. Every government that has tried to assert independence has been isolated and picked off one by one. But what if that changed? What if instead of fighting alone, we created a coalition?" Traoré studied the map. "You're talking about a fundamental restructuring of regional politics." "I'm talking about survival," Amara replied. "Mali, Niger, Guinea, they're all facing similar pressures. Chad and the Central African Republic are dealing with their own foreign intervention issues. What if we formalized mutual defense agreements, economic cooperation pacts, a shared strategy for dealing with external interference?" The idea was audacious to the point of seeming impossible, but as Traoré considered it, he began to see the potential. a coalition of African nations committed to genuine independence, could provide the economic and political mass necessary to resist external pressure. It would require complete trust between leaders who barely know each other, he said. Or, Amara smiled, it would require a very convincing advocate who could travel between capitals and build those relationships. The secret meeting took place in a nondescript conference room in Accra, Ghana. Officially, it was a regional development symposium sponsored by an international NGO. Unofficially, it brought together the most controversial leaders in West Africa for discussions that could reshape the continent's political landscape. President Traoré arrived with minimal security and maximum secrecy. Amara traveled separately, using a Nigerian diplomatic passport that had been quietly arranged through contacts in Lagos. The other participants included Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya from Guinea, Colonel Assimi Goita from Mali, General Abdourahmane Chiani from Niger, and surprisingly, several opposition leaders from countries still under traditional Western influence. The first day of meetings was tense and unproductive. Each leader was suspicious of the other's motivations, fearful of seeming too eager for alliance, and concerned about the consequences of being associated with what Western media had labeled the axis of African authoritarianism. It was Amara who broke the deadlock. On the second evening, instead of formal negotiations, she arranged for the leaders to share a simple meal together. No staff, no security, no recording devices. Just African leaders talking honestly about the challenges they faced. My country has the largest uranium reserves in the region, General Chiani said, speaking of Niger. But somehow we remain one of the poorest nations on Earth. Our uranium powers French nuclear plants while our people live without electricity. Gold, diamonds, bauxite, Colonel Doumbouya added. Guinea has enough mineral wealth to be a middle-income country. Instead, our resources leave on foreign ships and come back as finished products we can't afford. The conversation continued late into the night, moving from economic exploitation to political interference to the personal costs of challenging the established order. Each leader had similar stories, attempts at genuine reform met with diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and in some cases, direct threats against their families. The question, President Traoré said finally, is whether we're brave enough to change this pattern. By the end of the third day, they had the framework of an agreement, the West African Liberation Alliance, WALA. It wasn't a military pact or a formal political union, but rather a mutual support network focused on economic cooperation, information sharing, and coordinated resistance to foreign interference. The key innovation was what they called distributed resilience. Instead of each country trying to achieve complete self-sufficiency, they would specialize in different areas and create redundant supply chains across the alliance. If one member faced economic sanctions, the others would provide alternative trade routes and markets. But the real breakthrough came when Amara proposed something none of the leaders had considered: preemptive transparency. Instead of waiting for them to expose our secrets, she suggested, we publish everything ourselves: government budgets, foreign agreements, intelligence assessments, all of it available to our citizens and the international community. Complete transparency makes it impossible for them to use information warfare against us. It was a radical idea that made several leaders uncomfortable. Governments traditionally operated through secrecy and controlled information. But as they discussed it, the strategic advantages became clear. Transparency would eliminate the possibility of blackmail, reduce corruption, and most importantly, make it impossible for foreign actors to plant disinformation about government activities. The alliance was formalized in a document that would later be called the Accra Accords. But before any public announcement, each leader needed to return home and prepare their countries for what was certain to be a severe international backlash. The formation of WALA was announced simultaneously in all member countries on a Tuesday morning in October. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Western governments condemned it as a destabilizing alliance of authoritarian regimes. International financial markets suspended trading in several African currencies, and emergency sessions were called at NATO, the European Union, and the United Nations Security Council. But the alliance had prepared for this response. Within hours of the announcement, alternative trade agreements were activated with Russia, China, Iran, and Venezuela. New banking relationships that bypassed traditional Western financial systems went live. Most importantly, each member country launched massive public information campaigns explaining the historical context and strategic necessity of the alliance. President Traoré addressed the nation from the same podium where he had first announced Minister Douamba's arrest. But this time, Amara stood beside him, not as a mysterious foreign woman, but as an official advisor to the government and a symbol of Pan-African unity. "Today," Traoré said, looking directly into the cameras, "we choose to stand together rather than fall separately. This alliance is not directed against any nation or people, but against a system that has kept Africa poor while making others rich from our resources." The international response escalated quickly. Economic sanctions were imposed by the European Union and the United States. Several African countries, under pressure from their own foreign partners, publicly distanced themselves from the alliance. There were calls for United Nations peacekeeping interventions and threats of military action if the alliance engaged in aggressive activities. But something unexpected was happening at the grassroots level across Africa. University students in countries not part of the alliance were organizing solidarity protests. Civil society organizations were demanding that their governments explain why they continued to accept unfavorable economic relationships with former colonial powers. Social media was flooded with young Africans expressing support for leaders who were finally standing up. The real test came 6 weeks after the announcement, when French forces attempted a military intervention in Niger under the pretext of protecting French citizens. It was a classic neo-colonial playbook: create a security crisis, position military forces as peacekeepers, and gradually expand control until the target government was neutralized. But this time, the response was coordinated across the alliance. Burkina Faso and Mali immediately deployed troops to Niger's borders. Guinea mobilized its air force. Most importantly, the alliance activated what they called information warfare protocols, real-time documentation and broadcasting of every aspect of the intervention attempt. Within hours, the world was watching high-definition footage of French military equipment crossing Niger's borders, recordings of French officials coordinating with local opposition groups, and detailed financial records showing payments to anti-government protesters. The intervention that was supposed to look like humanitarian peacekeeping was exposed as naked aggression. International opinion shifted rapidly. African Union members who had initially remained neutral began demanding French withdrawal. Several European countries distanced themselves from the intervention. Most damaging of all, French citizens themselves began questioning their government's actions as social media filled with evidence of neo-colonial manipulation. The intervention was abandoned within 72 hours, but the political damage to traditional Western influence in Africa was permanent and severe. Amidst the political upheaval and international crisis, something personal was developing between Ibrahim Traoré and Amara Okoro. What had begun as a strategic alliance based on shared political goals had evolved into something deeper and more complex. It wasn't the romantic fairy tale that international media had portrayed when Amara first arrived at the palace gates. Both were too realistic, too focused on survival, and too aware of the stakes involved for simple romance. Instead, it was a partnership forged in crisis, tested by danger, and deepened by mutual respect. "I never asked if you actually want to marry me," Traoré said one evening as they walked through the palace gardens. The security situation had stabilized enough to allow some normalcy, though armed guards remained discreetly visible throughout the grounds. Amara was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. When I first came here, marriage was a strategy, a way to get close to you, to gain credibility, to have a platform for warning you about the threats you faced. But now I realize that what I really want is partnership. Marriage is a legal ceremony. Partnership is choosing to face the world together, to build something larger than either of us could create alone. They had reached a small gazebo overlooking the city lights of Ouagadougou. In the distance, they could see the neighborhoods where people were still celebrating the success of the alliance's first major test against foreign intervention. My grandmother told me once, Amara continued, that the best marriages are not between people who complete each other, but between people who challenge each other to become better than they thought possible. Traoré took her hand, noting the calluses from her recent weapons training and the small scar from the knife incident that had first proven her determination to defend herself. In traditional Mosi culture, he said, marriage is not just between two individuals but between two families, two communities. If we do this, you're not just marrying me. You're marrying the people of Burkina Faso, accepting responsibility for their welfare and their future. And you, Amara replied, would be accepting that your wife comes with her own mission, her own networks, her own commitments that extend across this continent. They stood in comfortable silence, both understanding that this conversation was really about whether two people with enormous responsibilities could create space for personal connection without compromising their larger purposes. The decision, when it came, was characteristically practical rather than romantic. We should make it official, Traoré said. Not because of love or politics, but because we work well together, and because our enemies will always try to use our personal relationship against us. Better to control that narrative ourselves. Amara smiled. Is that your idea of a proposal? Would you prefer something more traditional? No, she said, squeezing his hand. I prefer honesty. The wedding was announced as a state celebration, but planned as a political statement. Instead of a Western-style ceremony or even a traditional African royal wedding, they designed something entirely new, a public ceremony that celebrated African unity, featured music and traditions from across the continent, and was broadcast live to demonstrate the strength and confidence of the alliance. Leaders from all WALA member countries attended, along with representatives from supportive nations around the world. The ceremony took place in Ouagadougou's main stadium, filled with 60,000 people who had traveled from across West Africa to witness what media outlets were calling the wedding of African liberation. But the most powerful moment came not during the formal ceremony, but in Traoré's speech to the gathered crowd. Amara and I are not marrying just each other, he said, his voice carrying across the stadium through loudspeakers and radio broadcasts to millions more listening across the continent. We are marrying an idea, the idea that Africa can determine its own destiny, that our resources can serve our people, that our children can inherit a continent of dignity rather than dependence. The crowd erupted in cheers that could be heard throughout the capital city. 1 year later, President Ibrahim Traoré and his wife Amara stood on the same balcony where they had first discussed marriage, looking out over a transformed capital city. Construction cranes dotted the skyline where new hospitals and schools were being built with revenue from fairly priced mineral contracts. The streets bustled with economic activity as regional trade within the WALA alliance had replaced dependence on traditional colonial relationships. The alliance had weathered multiple attempts at destabilization and emerged stronger each time. 3 additional countries had joined in the past 6 months, and several others were negotiating membership. More importantly, the model of transparent governance and coordinated resistance to external pressure was being studied and replicated in other regions of Africa. The Chinese ambassador wants to discuss a new infrastructure partnership, Amara said, reviewing the day's diplomatic correspondence. The terms are actually fair. No debt traps, no political conditions, just straightforward development cooperation. And the French? Traoré asked, still trying to find a way back into relevance. They've proposed a renewed partnership based on mutual respect. But they're not willing to acknowledge the fundamental power imbalances that created the problems in the first place. Traoré nodded. Relations with former colonial powers remained complicated, but the dynamic had shifted fundamentally. Africa was no longer negotiating from a position of weakness and desperation. The education minister wants to discuss the new university curriculum, Amara continued. She's proposing that we teach African economic history alongside traditional subjects, so children understand how we got here and how we changed our trajectory. It was a small detail, but it represented something larger. The mental decolonization that was perhaps more important than political or economic independence. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A Nigerian woman's desperate gambit to warn an African leader about threats to his survival had evolved into a continental transformation that was reshaping Africa's relationship with the world. "Do you ever regret it?" Traoré asked. "Coming, here, starting all of this, changing your entire life?" Amara was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that we had to fight so hard for things that should have been basic rights, controlling our own resources, governing ourselves, making our own decisions about our future. But I don't regret the fight itself." She turned to face him, her expression serious but hopeful. "My father used to say that every generation of Africans has to choose between accepting the world as it is or working to make it what it should be. I'm glad we chose to build rather than just accept." In the distance, they could hear music from the city center where people were celebrating the anniversary of Minister Douamba's arrest, now observed as Liberation Day across the Alliance. Street vendors sold commemorative T-shirts featuring a lion and a phoenix, symbolizing strength and rebirth. As night fell over the capital, President Traoré and his wife began planning for tomorrow's challenges. There were still countries to liberate, systems to reform, and a continent to transform. The work of building true independence was never finished. But tonight, the lion and the phoenix stood together, looking out over a free city in a free country, knowing that sometimes the most impossible dreams are just the most necessary ones. The story that had begun with a woman sitting at palace gates had become something larger than anyone could have imagined. Proof that love, courage, and strategic thinking could indeed change the world. End.